In the peaceful rural town of Shell Lake, Saskatchewan, Canada, a heartbreaking tragedy unfolded in 1967, altering the lives of many and sending shockwaves throughout the nation. The Peterson family, once a symbol of hard-working, close-knit values, became the victims of one of the most devastating events in Canadian history.
On the surface, Kathleen Peterson seemed to have everything. Born Kathleen Hunt in 1953 in Greensboro, North Carolina, she grew up in a family that valued education, ambition, and resilience. From a young age, Kathleen excelled academically. She had a natural aptitude for numbers and science, and by the time she reached college, she had already set her sights on a career that would challenge her intellect. She attended Duke University, one of the most prestigious schools in the South, where she studied engineering. At a time when women were still underrepresented in technical fields, Kathleen stood out not only for her intelligence, but for her determination. She graduated with a degree in civil engineering, an achievement that set her apart from many of her peers. Later, she earned an MBA, further solidifying her skills and ambitions. Kathleen's career flourished. She rose through the ranks in the corporate world, eventually working as an executive at Nortel Networks, a telecommunications giant. She was known as hardworking, decisive, and driven, a woman who could balance the demands of a high-powered career with her roles as mother, wife, and community member. Colleagues admired her. Friends adored her, but Kathleen was more than her resume. She was also charismatic, funny, and warm. She loved entertaining, cooking, and surrounding herself with friends. She had a wide circle of people who valued her presence, and she took pride in being both accomplished and approachable. Meanwhile, across town, Michael Peterson was charting a very different but equally ambitious course. Born in 1943, Michael had grown up with an intellectual streak. After high school, he attended Duke University, the same institution that Kathleen later attended, where he developed an interest in political science and literature. After graduation, Michael joined the Marine Corps, serving with distinction during the Vietnam War. His military service gave him discipline, but it also left him with scars, both physical and emotional. After returning from the war, Michael pursued a career in writing and politics. He briefly worked for the U.S. Department of Defense and even made an unsuccessful run for mayor of Durham. But he found his real passion in writing. His novels, many based loosely on his military experiences, gained a modest following. They weren't bestsellers, but they established him as a respected voice in his community. He also wrote columns for the local paper, sometimes controversial, always opinionated. Michael's personal life was complex. He had been married before and had two sons, Clayton and Todd, with his first wife, Patricia. Later, during his time in Germany, Michael and Patricia befriended another couple, George and Elizabeth Ratliff. When Elizabeth Ratliff died suddenly in 1985, found at the bottom of a staircase, eerily foreshadowing future events, Michael took guardianship of her two daughters, Margaret and Martha. By the time Kathleen entered the picture, Michael was already raising a blended family of 4 children. Kathleen, too, had a daughter, Caitlin, from her first marriage. When she and Michael married in the late 1980s, they brought their children together under one roof in Durham, North Carolina. The Peterson household was large, lively, and unconventional. Between the 5 children, Clayton, Todd, Caitlin, Margaret, and Martha, and the parents' busy careers, there was always something happening. Their home on Cedar Street in Durham was spacious and filled with life. Kathleen and Michael were known for hosting parties, social gatherings, and fundraisers. They were a prominent couple in their community, admired for their success and charisma. From the outside, their life looked charmed. Michael was the writer and intellectual, Kathleen the corporate executive. Together, they represented the American dream, wealth, influence, and a blended family that, despite its complexities, seemed happy. Kathleen, in particular, was the glue. She supported her daughter Caitlin, helped raise Michael's children, and treated Margaret and Martha as her own. Friends said she was fiercely protective, nurturing, and generous. Despite her demanding job, she always made time for her family. But beneath the image of stability, there were cracks. Michael's career as a novelist had stalled, and his political ambitions had fizzled. He relied financially on Kathleen's lucrative executive position at Nortel, which quietly shifted the power dynamic in their marriage. Kathleen, while proud of her career, sometimes felt the strain of being the primary breadwinner. There were also whispers about Michael's personal life, his bisexuality, his relationships outside the marriage, details that would later become central to the prosecution's case. At the time, though, the Petersons projected unity. They were the couple who threw lavish parties, who filled their home with laughter, who seemed unshakable by December 2001. Kathleen and Michael had been married for more than a decade. They lived in a sprawling mansion on Cedar Street, surrounded by their grown and nearly grown children. The home was filled with reminders of their lives together, bookshelves stacked with Michael's novels, photographs of family vacations. The noise and energy of a blended household it was, by most accounts, a good life. Kathleen was thriving at work. Michael enjoyed his writing and social circles, and their children were carving out their own paths. The Petersons had survived the challenges of blending families, financial stress, and personal differences. To neighbors and friends, they seemed enviable, but appearances can be deceptive. In just a matter of weeks, the perfect image would shatter, replaced by one of the most enduring mysteries in American true crime history. On the evening of Sunday, December 9, 2001, the Peterson home on Cedar Street was filled with warmth and familiarity. The sprawling house, with its library, garden, and winding staircase, was decorated for the holidays. Michael and Kathleen had spent part of the day relaxing, enjoying dinner, and watching television together. To friends and family, it was just another ordinary night in Durham. But by dawn, it would become one of the most infamous nights in American true crime. Kathleen had worked a long week at Nortel Networks, where the pressures of her executive role weighed heavily. The company was struggling in the early 2000s, and layoffs loomed. Though Kathleen was a high achiever, the stress showed. Still, she seemed upbeat that Sunday evening. She and Michael shared a bottle of wine, cocktails, and laughter as they sat by the pool and later moved inside it around 11 p.m. Kathleen logged onto her computer to send a few last-minute emails. Investigators would later use these emails to timestamp her final activities. She wrapped up correspondence with colleagues and confirmed holiday plans with friends. Her last recorded activity was around 11:08 p.m. Michael later claimed that after finishing her emails, Kathleen joined him outside near the pool to smoke and chat. He said they laughed, talked about life, and enjoyed each other's company before she went back inside to bed. He insisted she was alive and well the last time he saw her. What happened next has remained a matter of debate for more than 2 decades at 2:40 a.m. Michael dialed 911. His voice was panicked, breathless. "My wife. She had an accident. She's still breathing. Please come. Please." He told the dispatcher that Kathleen had fallen down the stairs. She was bleeding, unconscious, but alive. Minutes later, Michael called 911 again, more frantic this time. He shouted that Kathleen was no longer breathing, that her condition had worsened. First responders arrived quickly. What they found was a scene that would haunt them. Kathleen Peterson lay at the bottom of the narrow back staircase, her body twisted unnaturally. She was dressed in sweatpants and a sweatshirt, her hair matted with blood. The walls and floor around her were spattered and smeared with gore. Pools of blood had collected beneath her head. To the untrained eye, it looked less like a fall and more like a violent assault. Paramedics attempted resuscitation, but it was too late. Kathleen was pronounced dead at the scene. Michael, distraught, told officers that his wife had simply fallen. She had been drinking, he explained. She may have lost her balance, slipped, or tripped. He pointed to the narrow, steep staircase as evidence that such an accident was possible, but investigators were uneasy. The amount of blood seemed excessive for a simple fall. The spatter patterns on the walls, streaks, droplets, and smears reaching several feet high, suggested repeated blows or prolonged bleeding. Some officers whispered almost immediately, "This looks like a crime scene." As dawn broke, the Peterson home was no longer just a family residence. It was a sealed crime scene. Police photographed the staircase from every angle, collected samples, and noted the condition of Kathleen's body. Michael, still in shock, was escorted away for questioning. In the days that followed, suspicion only deepened. The autopsy revealed Kathleen had suffered multiple deep lacerations to her scalp. Though no skull fractures were present, the wounds seemed inconsistent with a single fall. The sheer volume of blood covering the walls, soaking the floor, struck forensic experts as unusual for investigators. One possibility became increasingly likely. Kathleen Peterson had not fallen down the stairs. She had been beaten to death at the bottom of them. And the prime suspect, as is so often the case in domestic tragedies, was her husband, the man who had called 911, the man who had lived with her in that house, the man whose story now seemed less credible with each passing hour. From the morning Kathleen Peterson's body was discovered at the bottom of the narrow back staircase, investigators felt uneasy. Something about the scene didn't add up. The sheer amount of blood, the patterns on the walls, the gashes on her scalp, it all suggested violence rather than a simple fall. Within days, the Durham Police Department shifted their focus from an accident to a homicide investigation. And the man at the center was Michael Peterson. Forensic puzzle. The autopsy findings raised red flags. Kathleen had suffered 7 deep lacerations to her scalp. The cuts were ragged and wide, but her skull showed no fractures. Pathologists concluded that the injuries could not have been caused by a simple tumble down the stairs. Instead, they suggested repeated blows from a blunt but narrow object, consistent with a fireplace tool or similar weapon. The blood evidence was also troubling. Streaks of blood fanned across the stairwell walls, with droplets reaching several feet up. Pools collected beneath Kathleen's head. To experts, the spatter indicated multiple impacts rather than a single fall. Investigators searched the Peterson home for a weapon. They didn't find one immediately, but they did notice something missing. The blow poke, a hollow metal fireplace tool given to Kathleen as a gift years earlier. Michael said it had gone missing long before Kathleen's death. Prosecutors would later argue that this missing blow poke was the murder weapon. Motive, but why would Michael kill his wife? Investigators dug into the Petersons' personal lives, and soon, secrets began to unravel. Financial stress was one possibility. Kathleen was the breadwinner, earning a 6-figure salary at Nortel Networks. Michael's writing career had stalled, and his income was modest compared to Kathleen's. At the time of her death, Nortel was undergoing major financial struggles, and Kathleen's stock options, worth millions, were at risk of collapse. Prosecutors argued that Michael stood to benefit from Kathleen's life insurance if she died. But the most explosive revelation came not from finances, but from Michael's personal life. Through searches of his computer and interviews with acquaintances, investigators uncovered that Michael was bisexual and had been engaging in sexual relationships with men throughout his marriage. They found explicit emails and evidence that he had arranged encounters with male escorts. Prosecutors argued that Kathleen discovered this secret the night of her death, sparking a violent argument. They claimed Michael, fearing exposure and marital collapse, killed Kathleen in a fit of rage. The Ratliff connection, as if the case wasn't sensational enough. Investigators uncovered a chilling connection from Michael's past. In 1985, while living in Germany with his first wife, Michael had been close friends with a woman named Elizabeth Ratliff. Elizabeth died suddenly, found at the bottom of a staircase in her home. At the time, her death was ruled accidental, attributed to a brain hemorrhage. But now, with Kathleen's eerily similar death, authorities re-examined Ratliff's case. Her body was exhumed in Texas, where she had been buried. The new autopsy concluded that Elizabeth's injuries were consistent with homicide. Prosecutors presented this as evidence of a pattern. 2 women close to Michael, both found dead at the bottom of staircases under suspicious circumstances. The trial. Michael Peterson's trial began in 2003, and it quickly became one of the most sensational cases North Carolina had ever seen. The prosecution painted a damning picture. Michael was a man leading a double life, financially dependent on his wife, hiding his bisexuality, and capable of explosive violence. They argued that Kathleen discovered his secret life. They fought, and he killed her with the missing blow poke. They emphasized the sheer volume of blood, the scalp lacerations, and the Ratliff connection as proof of his guilt. The defense countered with their own narrative. Kathleen was intoxicated, tired, and stressed. She fell down the narrow staircase and struck her head repeatedly on the steps and molding. They argued the lacerations could be explained by an accidental fall. As for the blow poke, they maintained it had nothing to do with Kathleen's death and was simply misplaced. Defense attorneys also attacked the credibility of the prosecution's forensic expert, Dwayne Deaver, who testified that the blood spatter was consistent with a beating. Years later, Deaver's credibility would collapse under accusations of misconduct in other cases, but at the time, his testimony carried weight. The trial lasted nearly 3 months. The courtroom was packed daily, with reporters, true crime enthusiasts, and curious locals. The case gripped the nation, especially after filmmakers gained access to document the proceedings, footage that would later become the acclaimed Netflix series The Staircase. On October 10, 2003, the jury returned a verdict: guilty of first-degree murder. Michael Peterson was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. For Kathleen's family, the verdict brought relief. They believed Michael was guilty, that justice had been served. For Michael's supporters, it was a devastating blow, the culmination of a trial they argued was biased and sensationalized. But the story was far from over. After the guilty verdict in October 2003, Michael Peterson was led away in handcuffs, sentenced to life in prison without parole. For Kathleen's family, her daughter Caitlin in particular, it felt like closure. They believed justice had been served. But Michael's defense team never gave up. They immediately began filing appeals, arguing that the trial had been riddled with errors and that the prosecution had relied too heavily on circumstantial evidence and questionable forensic testimony. Years behind bars prison was a stark new reality for Michael. He was in his late 50s when he entered, accustomed to a life of literature, politics, and cocktail parties. Now, he lived in a cell, his world shrunk to cement walls and iron bars. Still, he adapted. He read constantly, wrote letters to friends and family, and even continued working on manuscripts. His children, Todd, Clayton, Margaret, and Martha, stood by him, visiting when they could, maintaining their belief in his innocence. That Kathleen's daughter Caitlin, however, had severed ties. She had once stood by Michael in the days after her mother's death, but the revelations about his secret life and the evidence presented at trial convinced her otherwise. She sided firmly with her mother's sisters, Candace and Lori, who had long believed Michael was guilty. For nearly a decade, Michael lived with little hope of freedom. But then, cracks began to form in the foundation of his conviction. Duane Deaver's collapse in 2009, Michael's attorneys discovered new information that changed everything. Duane Deaver, the state's blood spatter expert whose testimony had been crucial in securing Michael's conviction, was under investigation. It turned out Deaver had a long history of misconduct at the North Carolina State Bureau of Investigation, SBI. He had exaggerated results, misrepresented data, and withheld evidence in multiple cases. In some instances, innocent people had been convicted based on his faulty science. When a judge reviewed Deaver's record, he concluded that his testimony in Michael's trial had been deeply flawed. The very foundation of the prosecution's forensic case crumbled in 2011. After 8 years in prison, Michael Peterson was granted a new trial. The courtroom erupted with gasps as the ruling was announced. For Michael's children, it was a moment of vindication. For Kathleen's family, it was a painful reopening of wounds they thought had closed. Out on bond in December 2011, Michael was released on bond, pending retrial. After nearly a decade behind bars, he walked out of prison, older, thinner, but still defiant. He returned to live with his children in Durham, where he awaited the next phase of his legal battle. The retrial process dragged on for years. The state prepared its case again, but the momentum had shifted. Without Deaver's testimony, the prosecution's forensic evidence was weaker. Witness memories had faded, documents had aged, and the case no longer carried the same clarity it had in 2003. Meanwhile, Michael's defense argued more forcefully than ever that Kathleen's death had been a tragic accident, or perhaps something even stranger, the owl theory, one of the most bizarre, yet surprisingly plausible. Alternative explanations was the owl theory, first proposed by a neighbor and later supported by some forensic experts. It suggested that Kathleen had been attacked by a barred owl outside the house. The owl's talons, they argued, could have caused the scalp lacerations. Disoriented and bleeding, Kathleen may have stumbled inside and fallen down the stairs, leading to her death. Though unusual, the theory explained certain details, including microscopic owl feathers and wood splinters found in Kathleen's hair. While the jury in 2003 never heard the owl theory, it became a point of fascination in the years that followed, adding yet another layer of mystery to the case. The Alford plea by 2017. After years of delays and negotiations, both sides reached a resolution. Michael Peterson agreed to enter an Alford plea to the reduced charge of manslaughter. The Alford plea allowed Michael to maintain his innocence while acknowledging that the state had enough evidence to convict him. It was a compromise. Michael avoided another full trial and the risk of another life sentence, while the state secured a conviction. On February 24, 2017, Michael stood in a Durham courtroom, frail but resolute, and entered the plea. He was sentenced to time served and walked out a free man after spending more than 15 years entangled in the justice system. For Kathleen's family, it was a bitter outcome. They believed Michael had murdered Kathleen and that justice had been diluted. For Michael's supporters, it was relief, a chance for him to live out his remaining years outside prison walls. The staircase, even as the legal saga unfolded. The Peterson case was reaching millions worldwide through film. A French documentary crew had been granted extraordinary access to Michael's trial in 2003, resulting in the series The Staircase. First released in 2004, it followed Michael's defense in intimate detail, capturing behind-the-scenes strategy and family dynamics. When Netflix acquired the series in 2018, adding new episodes that covered the appeals and Alford plea, the case exploded into global consciousness. Viewers debated endlessly. Was Michael guilty? Was Kathleen's death an accident, a murder, or something in between? The show became a cultural phenomenon, inspiring podcasts, articles, and even a dramatized HBO series starring Colin Firth and Toni Collette. Legacy and mystery today. The Peterson case remains unsolved in the truest sense. Michael maintains his innocence. Kathleen's family remains convinced of his guilt. Experts continue to argue over blood spatter, stair geometry, and the possibility of owls. What is certain is that Kathleen Peterson's life ended violently on that December night in 2001, and her story has become one of the most enduring true crime mysteries of the modern era. For Michael, the saga left him a free but haunted man. He moved away from Durham, lived quietly, and continued writing. He never remarried. In interviews, he said he loved Kathleen and would never harm her, but he accepted that the shadow of suspicion would follow him forever. For Kathleen, her legacy is more than just the staircase. She was a brilliant executive, a mother, a friend. Her life was defined by achievement and generosity, not just by the tragic way it ended. And for the world, the Peterson case is a reminder of how fragile truth can be. In the intersection of science, law, love, and violence, sometimes the answers remain elusive.